that you've seen and the things that you've done, online feedback. And also that we still have a whole bunch of t-shirts for sale, and also previous year's t-shirts for sale if you didn't get those. Previous years are half price, and of course all of the benefits go to the charity of your choice. So please help our charities. I have a bunch of swag, well at least some, I don't know how big a bunch is. Large t-shirts, who can wear larges? So one this way, and one this way. Do you know someone who can wear a large?
It's like the best response ever.
Anyone want stickies and is not afraid of getting hit on the head with them? All right, let me see how far I can get this at the back. God damn it! All right, so this isn't gonna throw it all because it's too light. Flip that. And this one is gonna go this way. All right, you guys, this demonstrates that you all need to be sitting up front. So get up and move. All right, and I really hope that you had a good con. I'm looking forward to this talk today because I'm very interested in new ways to classify malware so that we can use them for other data analysis. So John has been, what, have you been in this for a while? He works for
16 years.
For 16.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that's a while. He works for Fidelis Cybersecurity. He's an avid travel buff. He teaches at the University of Illinois as well. And when I asked him what he did for fun, he said he has 4 kids and no time for fun. So please welcome our speaker.
Thank you. Hope you're all not too hungover from last night, or at least you've recovered somewhat from it. Again, I'm John Bambanek. I'm going to talk about building an encyclopedia of malware configurations. Already read the bio a little bit. Part of what goes into why I'm doing this, right, is that I run several takedown-oriented groups. So I'm very active with law enforcement trying to prosecute actors behind big criminal operations. So that kind of goes into why I develop and how I develop the things that I do, and creates some biases in my data collection that we may or may not get time to get into. The short version of that is I just like to burn things, right? I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I have an attention span of 30 seconds and I get bored easy. So generally start all my talks, this general problem statement, and all of you are familiar with it because some form of this, right? As defenders, the white hat crowd, right? There are more criminal operators than there are people doing work, right? We've got unlimited job security forever as long as we're not a screw up, right? There's much more malware than there's reverse engineers to ever reverse. Everything we do is public. And it is very, very hard to actually get criminal prosecutions to happen. The 2 that I've been involved in that actually have gotten to the indictment stage took almost about a year and about 10 different countries involved. So, the economy does not favor us. This talk more about malware. So this little graph here is from VirusTotal, right? Shows the number of submissions that they've gotten in the last 7 days as of yesterday, right? And the orange line, I think, is the most pressing one, right? That's the number of distinct new files detected by something, roughly 400,000 if I recall right. There's no way that any human being can process all of that stuff. You're still going to need reverse engineers, but you need to get useful information out of that. A more humorous way of putting that is, right, the Chinese hackers can't hire enough people to keep track of all our vulnerabilities, right? For those who saw the Onion article from 3 months ago. It's hilarious, right? Because it's true. So short version, bad news, we're doomed. Good news is unlimited job security, right? So yeah, so first, right, talk a little bit about threat intelligence. A lot of people talk about this, and there's a Twitter account, ThreatBot, that really makes fun of a lot of people who do it wrong, But this is important to where I'm going with some aspects of this talk, right? There's data, right? Tons of IPs, domains, whatever. Pick lists of data. Is everything cool? Okay, right? That's just information. That doesn't make it intelligence, right? Intelligence, is critically examining information to create some actionable conclusion, right? There has to be some thought involved and, to get an idea of what the data is really telling you, right? So a list of IP addresses, domains, hashes, whatever, that you can buy from X security company that got $50 million in VC funding isn't necessarily intelligence, that's just tons of data, right? And part of that involves analyzing the adversary and getting in their head, which we won't talk too much about here, but knowing their motivations, their dispositions, and what they intend to do. So, how to deal with, 1 million plus samples of malware, potential malware a day, right? Full reverse engineering is off the table. No one has the bandwidth to do that because that takes too much time, right? Dynamic analysis, yeah, you can do some of that, but the standard analysis window for a sample for almost any dynamic sandbox is about 5 minutes, right? So you need a small data center to start processing all of that stuff. And there's problems with dynamic analysis that we won't go into of anti-sandboxing. Now, you can do some static analysis if you know how to pull the pieces out, and that's what we're going to talk about here. And that's very, very fast, right? I was able to process maybe a 1/4 terabyte of malware just for the static analysis piece within about an hour window and not using real high-end hardware. So this is very, very fast. So it can get you a lot of information from malware that you know how to work with and pull the information statically to get all of that data and then start pushing stuff that you can't do statically to dynamic sandboxing and then to the human reverse engineers. So the idea is making things a little bit more efficient. So starter kit to start this, almost everything except the feed of malware, is open source. So you can leave this talk and do this today if you want, and by all means, go have fun if you choose to do it, right? So you start with, and originally we started with rats, but now we're doing more than that. We'll talk about that in a second. But whatever you get is fine. And the reasons rats is that there's rat decoders out there that's open source we'll talk about in a second, right? Figure out what selection algorithm to say, okay, run this decoder, and then run whatever's appropriate, rip all the information out, put it in a database, all right? So internally, right, we're throwing it all into Splunk because that's everybody's favorite bit bucket, but then we'll share it out using NISP once that's up and available. All right, all that's open source, and you'll have links here in a second. Okay, so why are rats kind of a good prototype for doing this kind of stuff? Single stage malware, the configuration is what really matters, right? Because anybody can use Dark Comet, right? One of the most prolific rats out there, but you really care more about the configuration than you do that. All you really need to say about Dark Comet is it's Dark Comet. You care where it's beaconing out to and some of the other attributes. But rats are not only just, the script kiddie low-end tool, right? Intelligence agencies use it, high-end attackers use it, right? It's a good espionage tool, whether you're 15-year-old and in mama's basement trying to spy on somebody's webcam, or you want to, hack bank executives. It's a good tool for the job as long as you can deal with keeping it undetected, right? Dozens of well-known types to work with, but again, we do it for more than rats. So the idea is a good start prototype to start developing the tradecraft to move along. So, all right, you've got this. What can you do with all of these rat configs? Well, you can start burning them all, right? I can whack thousands of these, in one pop when I'm bored on a Friday night. Ultimately, like I said, this is going to go to law enforcement, certs, to start trying to clean stuff up automatically. Sinkholing is a possibility, and that's its own talk, right? What we're going to talk here more is the mining of the data for correlations, because that's where things start to get really, really interesting when you start seeing how an individual is changing their malware over time, or changing their configuration, or for that matter, switching malware families. Now you can start knowing something more about the adversary other than this is NJRAT, this is talking to this host name in Iran, right? Now you can kind of see where they're moving and get a better idea of what's going on behind them. So this here is the first piece of that puzzle. Like I said, malware decoders. Kevin Breen makes this, not mine, right? There's 30 some odd, I forget exact, 30 to 40 some odd of these that he open source, right? So if you feed it a malware sample, it dumps out a config. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. but uses Python, and very fast and very efficient because, it takes, whatever pieces out of the binary that it's configuration items, and that changes between malware types, and says, here's what you need to know, here's all the configuration that's relevant. And that's pretty much all anyone would ever need to know about many of these samples, okay? Actively developed, if you email him, he'll make changes. Kevin's a good guy, love what he does, okay? Some sources of malware, VirusTotal being the only commercial one, right? Everybody knows VirusTotal. For enterprises that have security programs, Microsoft has a VIA program, Virus Information Alliance, where they can give malware and some of their telemetry out. It's a good program to be involved in, and that's saying something because I'm kind of an anti-Microsoft bigot, but this is something good that Microsoft does. And there's sharing programs, internal sources that we develop. And in the end of the day, it's about a 1/4 terabyte of malware that we're processing right now, and hopefully to get that up a whole lot higher. And if you have malware you want to trade, then by all means, let's talk and figure out what kind of exchange you're looking for that. Okay. So every malware has some kind of configuration items. At the very minimum, C2 information. Malware needs to talk to somewhere, and it needs to figure out where that is. In practice, though, there's a lot of other items that go into it, some of it which is just configuration, right? Do I want to turn off McAfee? Do I want to have anti-sandboxing, anti-debugging? Do I want to install in this path, right to this registry key? There's a lot of information, and there's also some free-form text fields. Now, if you're a criminal, I love criminals writing text in free-form text fields. That really makes my job easier. I have no idea why you do that, but please keep doing it, all right? So, that's really, where you can get some interesting correlation, get some interesting data. There's also some fixed things, mutex being a good example. We can correlate based on mutex. Everything else changes, but the mutex being random, you have to push a button to re-randomize it. That provides something that lets you map various campaigns together to the same actor over time, right? So as an example of some of the configurations, right, here's Dark Comet, not typically sophisticated, but it's out there. It's 8 to 10,000 samples of Dark Comet, in a given month, right? So campaign ID. Why in the world anyone would do anything but a default value for campaign ID, I have no idea. Guess 16 is default, right? But Dark Comet will also happily allow you to use FTP to get keylogs. So it has to authenticate to an FTP server. So you see username and password, not in this particular sample, right? So a lot of information, right, that you can use fairly quickly, and some things that are a little bit, a little bit less clear of how you would operationalize it immediately. Mutex and GenCode, for instance, right? But we'll talk more about that. Again, NJRAT, you see similar things, but different field. It's a different malware, does things differently, right? Yeah, in this case, writes to registry. That registry value, again, is a randomly generated thing. You got to push a button to re-randomize it, so that can provide some ability to correlate between different samples, right? Host, domain name, port, some configuration items, right? So dumping this, like I said, the raw text version of this, into a CSV, kind of looks, like this. You got hash value, description, campaign ID. You see the third one in there, FUD, right? That's, something discrete that I could say, hey, who's using that campaign ID? Can I correlate to other things, right? The last item on there is username and password for an FTP server. I redacted it. Sorry, I didn't think it was entirely appropriate to put somebody's username and password on a slide at a talk, but they were also the same value, so on top of putting that stuff in their malware, they're not even doing good authentication, right? So, again, right? There you go. The grug is unamused. Why people do that, I have no idea, but thanks for doing it. So between all the families, and actually there's a whole lot more fields, it just ran up all the slides. This gets to how difficult it is to kind of data normalize all this stuff. Every piece of malware has its own configuration items that it calls something. So you've got all of these lists of fields, right? And not all of them are used, and not all of them are necessarily useful, from an intelligence perspective. Whether something turns off AV or not, it's not irrelevant, but it's probably not the most useful information there. So, from here, like I said, how can you win it at the venture capital game? You could take all these C2s or just rip it from VirusTotal, with the low cost of an API key, anything that ever detects, get the network information, get your venture capital funding, right? Create some map, right? And there's your money. And people do this, right? I don't know if it's a viable business model, but people are getting real money for it. But that's really not the most useful thing. Other things need to be done with this data, and we're going to talk in depth more before using it or before making conclusions based on it. Okay? So why store all this data locally, right? Because VirusTotal keeps a lot of it, but VirusTotal doesn't keep configuration information. There's some aspects that it will have, mutex in cases, network information if the sample runs, but if you have all of that configuration information local, now you can start correlating, and we'll show a little bit about that. The key point, however, is that the key point for this, however, is that when you observe stuff at the time, you may not even know what you're looking for. Very, very often it's just like a week later, say there's an incident. Almost all incidents are already in an organization by the time they're observed, by the time somebody responds to it. If you knew what to look for, you'd have a rule in place to stop something. If I knew what malware, all the malware C2s were, I could block it at a perimeter firewall, right? Probably not the most efficient thing to do, but you could do that. This allows you to kind of go back, hey, now I know something more about what I'm looking for. Now let's see historically what is also mapped to that pattern. So now you can map backwards in time depending on how long this runs, and I'm hoping to run 10 years of malware through it at some point in the future. Now I can map back what somebody's been doing for 8 months, which is very useful information. A lot of the prosecutions happen because it's not just a discrete attack, a discrete event, its ability to map that actor's behavior over time and to find the point where they screwed something up or did something to expose their identity, right? Silk Road is an example. DD4BC, the DDoS for Bitcoins guy, was arrested last month in Eastern Europe. And the way that prosecution happened at a very generic level that I could talk about, right, is taking all of the emails, all the indications of the attack, in whole and total, and be able to map all the behavior back to a single person. Doing that for one discrete event, one Bitcoin wallet, one email and headers, very hard. But being able to process over all of it, then patterns emerge that start to be able to correlate back to an individual. Okay? So that's why the historical information is important. Okay? The other thing is I'm more of a network-oriented guy. I don't really do much endpoint stuff. It's not as interesting for me, and that's fine. We all have our preferences. So when I first started gathering this, I focused more on the C2 side. Give me the network indications because I know what to do with that stuff. But then some host-based guys come along, hey, you know what, we can do IOCs, we can use this data in forensics or whatever, and some other pieces of this become more useful, right? So even then, my particular use case has shifted over time. So now you can take a host-based IOC, backtrace it, all sorts of interesting things you can do here. Okay. So most of these rats, malware families have, their free-form items. Campaign ID, pass, mutex, registry keys. These tend to be the interesting things to correlate off of. Just doing, basically, histogram, statistical, modeling of it. Some have authentication information. Thank you for putting that in your malware. All of it can be correlating to specific things. For some particular reason, criminals like using campaign IDs to containerize things. I have no idea why you would do that unless you're making sure you change your campaign ID every time. But people do that. So in the case of Dark Comet, right, here's just raw counts of campaign IDs that we're seeing, right? Guess 16 min, default values. Then you have a whole bunch of other things. Kurban, you'll see a bunch of iterations of that, which is Turkish for victim, if I recall right. There's some Spanish stuff in there. Occasionally you have things in Arabic. So, even then, campaign ID might tell me something about the language somebody likes to speak. Not enough to make a conclusion, but it's interesting, right? I don't know many people who would pick the Turkish language to choose campaign IDs unless you're familiar with the Turkish language, but It could be somebody who's trying to deceive you, but useful information. If anybody does kind of statistical analysis, usually, right, the interesting data is at the margins, the most frequent and the least frequent. Not so much in this particular case, because the most frequent is going to be default values. The least frequent is going to be the one-time observance, and that doesn't give you much. Right? The interesting correlations will be somewhere in the middle, and we'll show you that in a minute. You know, sometimes interesting names crop up, right? So this is for JSocket, Java-based RAT, you know, of discrete campaign IDs, right? And obviously the one in bold is the one just looking at this. Well, that's interesting, an oddly specific reference, August 21st, 24th bombing, right? Vaguely seemed familiar to me. You know, was there a bombing on August 24th? Well, in fact, there was, right? This happened to be a discrete terrorist event, or an aircraft bombing in the Russian Federation 2004. All right, so now this seems to be really interesting. So now let's just dig deeper. It says, I want to correlate on anything, any JSocket thing with bomb in the title. This is probably not the most readable slide, but you'll see in bold the same C2, and then you see fresh underscore bomb, August bombing, July 1st bombing, 1st July bombing, August 24th bombing, September 3rd bombing, right? Same actor, you know, and you know, some iteration of bomb, you know, in their title. So looking a little bit deeper, right? US-based C2, you know, of Nick Resit, right? You know, Zapto, which is no IP. So, you know, nothing atypical there, right? So this is kind of a counterexample of correlation, just because people like making spurious correlations, right? And that's the biggest outcome of big data, is spurious conclusions. And that's obviously sarcasm, right? You know, but despite the ominous name, right, this individual just likes calling his attacks bombings, right? It has nothing to do, and it just happened to be, you know, an odd coincidence. You know, however, you know, if you're a media-driven security researcher, you know, you're gonna see this, and you're gonna write a blog post about some, you know, probably Chechen dissident who's running JSocket in memorial of this bombing attack, right? You know, but being able to correlate backwards shows that that's pretty much crap. All right? So correlating with mutexes, again, we talked about that a little bit. Now we're going to do it in practice, right? Interesting data is in the middle, right? You know, so this is all of them, right? 1867, I think that's just one decoder, just has everything in mutex, plugin, and then you see DC underscore mutex dash, and then a random seven character, you know, alphanumeric string, all right? You press in the dark comment bin, you press re-randomize, it regenerates that 7-digit string. So I just picked one of those, right? 1FBM SBT. Not terribly likely in the real world that you're going to find two separate individuals who end up with the same mutex. Theoretically possible, but not probably likely. So running back, you know, of everything that mapped to that mutex, you know, with dark comment, I see things that despite the discrete IP addresses or host names, you know, of time for what, starting from July to December, so 5 months, uses all except in that one instance right there in August, all uses the same campaign ID of DOS, right? So now I'm able to sit there and take a look at an actor that says, now I know where he's been for about 5 months, you know, which is very useful information because I might be able to, you know, have a box seized, whatever, grab it, and then get some more information, right? But this is very useful. Now I can see patterns of behavior, which gets you to analyzing adversary capabilities and motivations, because one-time event doesn't give you a pattern. There's nothing much to analyze except the technical in a one-time event, right? Knowing this, for instance, I can start manipulating this guy and then see how he moves. I can provoke him to move and see what happens, right? I can, you know, do network traces or flows on those addresses and see, is this him just containerizing operations where he has one set of victim talking here, one set of victim talking there, you know, and get a better understanding of exactly what this person is doing, right? And those dates isn't, you know, it's just a date when the malware was first observed, right? This is probably coming from VirusTotal. This malware could be going out all the time. Just because something's in July doesn't mean that that malware is not still in circulation, right? So very interesting things that you can do, like I said, with mutexes. This next one I call the Ashley-Madison correlation, password correlation trick, right? Everybody remembers the Ashley-Madison hack, right? Somebody sit there and took a look at all the passwords in their database and found that 400,000 female accounts were created by the same 4 people because they all use the same strong password, right? You know, so you're able to correlate people based on strong passwords. We tell everybody, do a strong password, you know, which is good. Please do strong passwords, but it also becomes a unique identifier to correlate somebody. Even if everything else is different, odds are the same person is not going to have the same strong password, right? So in this, it was a funny thing for Ashley Madison, right? You know, 400,000 fake female accounts, which shouldn't be surprising, but we can do that also with this database, right? Because there's also FTP usernames and passwords. Some malware families will have in essence, a password to authenticate client to server, right? So you can start using some of that. Here is, you know, a case of, you know, basically a raw list of just password counts, unique password counts in the database, right? So some things, admin, administrator, so even hacker, you know, criminals can't do good passwords. So I picked something in here, what was it? Version 2013, oddly specific, middle of that list there. So let's see, you know, odds are somebody's probably not going to put that in there. 2 individuals are going to do that twice. So in here case, points to 3 different C2s, you know, samples. One is in the U.S., one is in Hong Kong, actually, yeah, and the other 2 are in Hong Kong, right? So don't know too much, it's poison ivy, so it's a rat. Don't know too much else about that, but can kind of correlate things just based on that password, right? So very interesting things that you can do. The technique can also feed domain generation algorithms, right? There's a lot of malware out there, right, that uses DGAs and, you know, a mathematical formula to create pseudo-random host names to use for C2 communications, right? Usually based on some seed or some set of inputs, right? So you can process malware just to get that information and be able to pull that out, because in this case for Tinba, maybe 100, 120 different sets of seed information for TinyBank or Tinba, right? So just being able to keep track of that and how that changes and feed that into whatever you're doing in terms of surveillance, right, which is a different talk entirely. But you see here, top, CNC gives you the first host name that it uses, TLDs at the bottom, and then there's a seed in the top, the RC4 key. So with those 3 things, given a Tinba DGA script, which is on GitHub, I mean, you can download it, you can now generate the domains for this sample, which might be all that you need for TinyBanker. Okay? Now all of this generally, or I should say not all of it, about 2/3 of it use DNS, right, for C2 communication, right? Now my data is biased heavily towards rats for now, so that affects, you know, the reliability of that data, right? A lot of people say, hey, listen, I've got a database of 100,000 configurations. Here, come buy it. Well, those 100,000 configurations can be complete crap. So what this shows you right here is that, you know, the biggest percentage, roughly 60 some odd percent, of DNS information in those configurations is NX domain, does not resolve, which means I'm selling you an indicator that is no use to you, right? You know, big whoop. Now we'll talk about that. That's you know, there is reason to keep that around, right? But at the present point in time, it is useless information, right? Resolved is the next big chunk. RFC 1918 addresses could be testing, could be something else. We'll talk about that specific case in a second. And then 0000, right? Which is when no IP suspends one of their host names, they point it to quad zeros. I don't know, that's just what they do, right? So a fair bit of these were already suspended by the provider. Okay? So most rats, right, certainly historically are no longer actively resolving. Now you could use passive DNS or some other technique to figure out where those were, and that's useful for investigative purposes. But passive DNS does miss quite a bit, right? Just kind of a rough check was about 25% of the host names that I saw in malware configurations were not caught by passive DNS. Not entirely scientific, because I kept running against my API limit and they kept shutting me down. But the other key point to remember this is just something because something is NX domain or something resolves to 1918 space doesn't mean it's not still malicious, right? DNS is under control of the adversary for their host names or their domains. They can do what they want, right? Many sophisticated, attackers, up to and including intelligence agencies, get that they don't need to have their C2s up 24/7, 365. They only need their C2s up for the 15 or 30 minutes that they're operational. So they'll have it resolved, the malware happily beacons out for 30 minutes while they're doing whatever operational goals that they're doing, and then they're done and they turn it off, right? So it's just because something's NX domain doesn't mean it's useless. It just means it's not valuable information right now. So still keeping that around and forcibly resolving it every now and then to see if it changes and track that is very important information to certainly get to those times where they are operational, and now I know where they live, okay? And the other thing to keep that host name around is the thing to bear in mind is that most RAT protocols don't have host name in the header. They're not HTTP based. So you still have to do something with those host names to make that into a network detectable item. Okay. So, where do rats live in terms of, or I should say, where do C2s live, right? There's the top cities, top countries, right? And if you're an unsophisticated venture capital funded intelligence firm, you're going to say, hey, look, the FSB is in the rat business. It's the most common, second most common country, right? Cairo, all right, that's Egypt, Istanbul, right? We saw the Turkish stuff before, Baghdad, interesting stuff. Maybe it's ISIS, whatever. No, not really. It's time for your threat butt check, right? Just because something is somewhere doesn't mean a country is behind it, right? Which is the biggest source of all of these overhyped news articles that we see. Oh, there's a malware C2 in Russia. That means the Russian government shut down this power plant. Cool story, bro. So, yeah, if you do that, just stop. Just stop. I'm tired of figuring out why these stories are crap, right? So, key point, correlation is not causation. Just because something happens to be Russia doesn't mean Russia's involved with it, okay? But again, to keep in mind, almost all of the data in security investigations is generally under the control of the attacker, who has the ability and means to deceive you, right? DNS is a great example, for all of these C2s. I think, here's the first example, right? Here's a malware configuration, dark comet, right? Yeah. Third line from the top. Probably can't see it, but the domain, the C2 is quad 8s, 8.8.8.8. How many people here think that Google is running a dark comet C2? I think Google doesn't need to run a rat. They've got our search logs, right? They don't need any. They have it all. So this is somebody, I don't know, testing something, screwing with data, right? There are a subset of attackers who do know we mine VirusTotal, who do know we mine DNS indicators and actively try to poison that information, right? Another aspect of what I do is DGA surveillance, so resolve all the domains and active DGAs, and I've seen people put quad 8s in there. The adversary himself, resolve it to quad 8s, and I get a call, I'm using your IP list and we're blocking Google. It's like, why are you doing that? Stop. Of course, no, I'm not going to create a white list of IP addresses. I put the DNS root servers in there just because that would be very, very destructive, right? But no, I'm not going to get in the business of whitelists. But just because something points in there that there's a malware configuration doesn't mean it's valid. Some other thing has to be done with it, right? So attackers know we're doing this, they throw mud in the water, right? We talked about the DGA stuff, but attackers could have easily submit stuff into VT and do so all of the time, right? And just because a C2 is in a given country or whatever doesn't mean anything in and of itself. It is a data point that is not sufficient to go do the analysis, right? So example 2, right? Kevin Breen makes decoders, they're public. You can, if you look Kev the Hermit, right? All of his rat decoders are public out there. Has one for JSocket. That particular actor knew that Kevin Breen was writing a decoder for JSocket, so he would change the encryption key that encrypts the dropper that is sent out from the builders. He changed the, and the password he changed it to is Kevin Breen is the gay, right? So intentionally trying to change something, but also intentionally knowing what we're doing, right? So that's just an example is that what we do is public, right? The attackers can operate in private, but generally we're making products or doing something. almost everything that we do is public, and the attackers respond to that, right? Talked a little bit about this. DNS resolution point in time. Some attackers will resolve when actively in operation and point them elsewhere when not in use, right? And they could point it to quad 8s too, and just to get somebody to say, you know what, I'm not looking at this, skunk binary, whatever. No, it actually could be something. So being mindful of that in the data, right? And now there's edge cases, right? So CryptoWall, right, has configuration. It's ransomware, but their configuration contains a list of compromised websites that have PHP files that begin the process of getting the encryption key to encrypt data on victim machines, right? So you could block all of those compromised sites, and that's not a bad option. I don't know if it's a particularly good one. Those compromised sites, you're probably blocking potentially valid use, right? And it's not just CryptoWall that uses compromised sites in doing stuff, right? Or for that matter, how many times has ad delivery networks served up malicious flash? You're not going to block New York Times because they do interstitial ads that may or may not be compromised, right? So, maybe you block it, maybe you don't, right? Similar problem, with word list-based EGAs where, they use the Declaration of Independence to create a host name, right? Those may have interesting collisions with real stuff, right? For one of the domains generated by Rob Nix a couple of months ago was independence.com, right? That's not a malicious site, that's a thing, right? It just so happens it's the collision with reality, right? And then the last thing, which is really interesting, right? There is a small subset of malware that uses basically encoded IP addresses. What I mean by that is you query something in DNS, it gives you an IP address, and then some function takes that IP address and converts it to what it really should be. So you may be pointing to an IP address, just doing DNS resolution that says, hey, it's 195 whatever, but really there's a process inside the malware that converts the DNS resolved IP address to what actually the IP address should be, right? So there's all these interesting edge cases to deal with, right? Using this also, you can sit there and look for C2s you might not otherwise see. My data relies on otherwise getting malware to process it, but I don't have 100% visibility, right? The more targeted an attack is, the likelihood of me seeing it or anybody seeing it drops off significantly. So you can use some of these strings to run in Showdown to find C2s, right? So a search here of a couple of strings, and then you can start finding port 1604, which is the default dark comet port, but it can be on anything you want. So Showdown can find some of these C2s that you could start adding to your own data, right? Okay. So, and there's also some parts of data that aren't in the configuration itself that also might be of interest. So in the case of SSL certificates, JSocket, for instance, the builder also doubles as a controller, and it is all over SSL, which all builders have the same SSL certificate because it's just built in. It doesn't randomly generate it, right? So pulling that out can give you some interesting information, right? So first, you've got an SSL cert that is known malicious. Anytime you see that cert in a handshake, you've got a problem. Okay. That's certainly viable. You can also do some searching with it with Showdown, but it's not working quite right yet. But here's an interesting thing with the issuer, right? Acilius, right? Oddly specific thing, French organization, Acilius Inc., Acilius, right? It's oddly specific of something that doesn't look. So I Google it, it goes to this blog post of somebody who talks about how to create, what is this, the Java key store thing? Yeah, key tool, which is how to create and put an SSL certificate in a Java key store, right? And JSocket uses that certificate to make sure no man in the middle work, because if it gets a certificate it doesn't expect, then it just drops the connection. So the author of JSocket used this blog post specifically, followed these instructions up to and including the issuer name and country. For a while, he even used the same password that was in that blog post of StorePass. He was smart enough to realize that that was a bad life decision and change that, but I can find the blog post he was using for instructions, all right? So I said, Some families of rats and malware also use APKs. APKs have to be signed. So those signing certificates then become useful stuff to go find other things, right? You know, a lot of Android malicious apps, I mean, it's kind of tricking people to install them outside the App Store. But there is a fair bit of malicious apps that still make it into the App Store. And now if I'm able to sit there and observe, hey, this builder builds with this, you know, this APK signing certificate, now I can go hunt in the App Store, not only Google's, but some of the other third-party app stores, and go find related malware, right? And in hundreds and maybe not 1,000, but certainly in the hundreds of cases, you know, we found malware in the stores just by doing certificate correlation. Okay, yeah. So this for JSocket has an Android part of it, right? So this is the details for its builder. What was most interesting out of this, and why I think Google should have caught it on their own, right? Some third-party, you know, app writer for Android is not going to have Oracle as a signer, as the issuer for a signing certificate. That ought to be something that's caught. And the other thing is, Oracle, right? There is actually a Cincinnati, Oregon, or was about 100 years ago. Now it's known as Yola or something like that. So, but it's certainly not in the European Union. All of that is invalid, right? Let's even skip past the Oracle part. You know, state, Oregon, country code, European Union. Come on, right? I'm sure the search engine of the world could manage to figure out that piece of data. Just a thought. Okay. So what's next, right? Like I said, all this DNS stuff is point in time. So there needs to be something on the front end or something on the back end that takes a look at that information to do some kind of validation, right? If somebody isn't hell-bent on creating firewall rules, right? Resolve all this stuff, get its IP address, resolve it continually. If it doesn't resolve, fine, drop it, right? And then just do kind of a SYN check. Hey, is port 1604 open on 8.8.8.8, right? Google doesn't run a dark comet, so that should come back null, right? So it gives you some basic information with which to say, all right, now I can at least create a relatively high confidence firewall set, but still take additional scrutiny on, say, port 25 and 80 and 443, a small handful number of ports, you know. But other than that, if the port's open, the IP, the DNS resolves, now I can create firewall rules with that, you know, and start getting to operationalizing it, right? I want to get to the point of processing historical malware, right? I've got about 8 months right now, but going back, you know, VirusTotal has a huge data set, Microsoft, anybody who has one, right? I'd love to run my stuff over it to get it into the database. And eventually I will share this out with MISP, so, you know, pay attention for that, where we'll give this back to the community. I do work for a security company, but this is something here. Everybody, here's a great intelligence tool, have fun with it and tell us what you can do. And I said, and ultimately I said, you know, my long-term goal is to burn and sink all the things, right? If I can't shut things down or put somebody in prison, then sinkhole it and start trying to clean up, right? So hopefully coming to a C2 near you will be Bullet Bill. Anytime, Bullet Bill. There you are. All right, so final points. We are hiring. You know, I've got 3 or 4 openings. That's a subject of debate. So if you're looking, if you like kind of some of this stuff, by all means, get in touch. If you want to share malware, otherwise work on any of the other things I'm interested in. I do DGA, DDoS, malware, ransomware. You know, come find me and let's burn things. Thanks to everybody who's helped with this, my team in particular. Any questions? Yes?
You have a slide, a pie chart of the different resolutions and domain. Did those domains include both DGA and non-DGA based?
This was just static domains. The question was, were there any DGAs part of this DNS resolution slide? And the answer is no. This was just the static stuff. For DGAs, it'd be like, I want to say, if you strip out sinkholes, it's like 99%, 98, 99% NX domain, right? You know, the biggest registrant of DGA domains is security companies. Any other questions? That's true. Sir. The question is, have I used Splunk or entropy analysis to correlate whether a given host name is a DGA? There are people who have done that. The problem comes into is, well, there's two problems. One is dealing with Latinized, non-Latin language host names. That makes sense, right? You know, somebody translating Chinese into the Latinized alphabet for a domain name. You tend to get some weirdness there. But the biggest problem with that is, yeah, I can be fairly confident and tell you something's a DGA type domain, but mapping that back and reverse engineering it into an algorithm to go to a family is where things get difficult, because our kind of lexical classification of DGAs is character set, length, TLDs. We don't have much else to work with yet. So there needs to be more work on that particular piece, if that makes sense. Okay. There was another question, this general region, I thought, or another hand. You let me off easy? Nobody wants to throw anything at me besides you two? Yes. What about misattribution, right? And nation states who are trying to mimic other entities or nation states to create geopolitical tomfoolery, right? That's why I qualify using this stuff in and of itself. There has to be more analysis done to really call it intelligence, right? This is data. I mean, you can make some intelligence conclusions in some cases, but yeah, if I were the CIA or the NSA, yeah, I'd be making people think I was China all day long, or it's somebody else. Oh, absolutely, intelligence agencies will do that, but that takes data and a human spending time to figure it out. Because eventually, given enough data and enough observable events, you can start saying, well, that doesn't really map to what they ought to be doing if I were an intelligence agency, and seeing that. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else? Sure. Bayesian analysis where you may believe something is malware but don't know, or? Oh, okay. Yeah, you certainly could do that. I don't know if I have a long enough data set where that would yield as much fruit. But yeah, I mean, if I can get 10 years of malware, then yeah, then we're talking Bayesian and other really, really neat things. Anybody else? Or another question? No? All good? All right, thank you.